Good morning, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to present our first results from the Danish experiment. And I'm sorry it has to be in English. I actually took Spanish at school and I used to be very good at it, but I lost it. So it will have to be in English. But if you have questions and you're a bit shy with your English, you can try to ask in Spanish. Maybe I can understand. That would be good. So my name is Mathilde Coutant. I am a postdoctoral researcher at Aarhus University in Denmark. And today I will present to you what we have done at our facility in terms of experiment with pigs. So I will show you a bit of the design of the experiment, what we measured during the experiment, and we also have some very preliminary results, so you can have a little idea of what we have seen. Yes. So first, I just want to quickly introduce our team because I'm presenting today, but we are several people working on this experiment. We have Professor Line Pedersen, Assistant Professor Mona Larsen, and Mona has been the one doing all the statistics and analysis. So all the graphs that I'm going to show you today were prepared by Mona, so it's a team effort. And we also have Tine Housing on the team. She was not directly involved in that experiment, but she was involved in previous work on measuring welfare on farm and other parts of the mEATquality project. So we're a little team all together. And I just want to do a little commercial for ourselves because we are now on Twitter, our group called Animal Behavior, Stress and Welfare. We've been on Twitter for 3 weeks now. So if you have Twitter and you want to hear about all the exciting work we're doing for mEATquality, but also for other projects, feel free to follow us. We're always happy to have more followers. So a bit about the experiment. The aim was to compare the effects of different extensification factors on indicators of animal welfare and mEATquality. So that's roughly what Marianne has introduced previously. But here in Denmark, we focused on conventional pig husbandry, so indoor pigs. And our experiment focused on 3 extensification factors: the space quantity, so how much space they have, the space quality, so if they are given enrichments, and the diet. So we did not look at genetics. All of the pigs had the same genetics, but we varied those 3 different factors. So we tested altogether approximately 830 pigs, and we had them in our experiment from 30 kilos all the way up to slaughter at approximately 110 kilos. And an important point is that in Denmark, at least, most of the pigs are tail docked, so their tail is cut when they're young. It is not allowed legally, but farmers can do it if they have issues with tail biting, so with pigs eating each other's tails. And most of the farmers have issues with tail biting, so therefore they cut the tails. But here we really wanted to be able to see the effect of the different treatments on tail biting, so on how much they eat each other's tail or not. So we included pigs that had the full tail, so they were not tail docked before they arrived in the experiment. So that was a little twist that we had. And we had 2 rounds, so 2 repetitions of the experiment. The first one was from March to April 2023, and the second one from September to November 2023. And both experiments, they happened on our experimental farm. So it was not a commercial farm, it was our own experimental farm on our campus in Viborg. So that's the picture you can see. And that meant that because it was our own experiment in our own farm, we could measure a lot of different things. We could really do what we wanted. And we also had, compared to going out on a real farm, we had much more standardized condition and a more controlled environment. So it was a little bit better to do this kind of experiment. So this is what a typical pen looked like in our experimental facility. I think, yeah, you can see my little mouse here. So in terms of the floor, you can see here they have a concrete floor at the back of the pen, and that is where they are supposed to be able to lie and rest. And then they have a partially slated floor for the rest of the pen. And here it's more adjourned, and that is where they're supposed to defecate. Here we have in each pen a feeder where there's space for 3 pigs to feed. And all the pigs at all time, they were fed ad libitum. So they were fed all the feed they wanted. So they always had a full feed. They had 2 drinkers here and here. And then they had a leaded enrichment. All of the pens had a bit of enrichment because that's a legal requirement in Denmark. They have to have 1 or 2 of those wood beans. They don't really care about them, but that's legal requirement. So it was there. And then they had those solid walls on the side, except in those areas here and here where they could see and they can touch with the nose their neighbors. And they also had a sprinkler system. So that's when here in this area, they get little showers from time to time. And the point of that is to keep this area wet so that they don't want to lie there. So the point is to keep the pen clean by preventing the pigs to lie here, forcing them to lie over here while it's more clean. So then they can defecate there and lie there, and then they have a more clean pen, if you're not familiar with the system. So just to give you a little idea of what it looks like, you can see here I think the mist, the water coming in. It's actually not meant to be an enrichment, but the pigs really liked it. And you can see here in the meantime, the solid floor, the slated floor, the drinker, etc. So those were the pens that every treatment had. Then we had 5 different treatments. So they all had the same pen, but they were treated a bit differently. First of all, we had control pigs. So those pigs, they were 18 per pen, which corresponds to a density of 0.7 meters square per pig, which is a conventional density. So that's the density you find in conventional pig farming in Denmark. Then we had 2 space treatments. So in the first one, there were only 9 pigs per pen. So they had a density of 1.4 meters square per pig, which is more space per pig. And that's the level of space that you find in free-range housing. And then we had another treatment where there were only 6 pigs per pen. So they had each of them 2.1 meters square per pig. And that's the level of space you find in organic production. Then we had a diet treatment. So they had a normal density of 18 pigs per pen. But on top of their normal diet in the feeder, they were given a bucket of roughage. So it was rye-based roughage every morning. And the point of this roughage is it's high in fibers, so it improves digestion. It has a lot of benefits diet-wise, and it also allows the pig, because it's given directly on the floor, it allows the pig to forage a little bit more for their feed. It's not just in the feeder. So it's a kind of enrichment, but it's a diet treatment. And then we had an enrichment treatments where again they had the normal density of 18 pigs per pen, but they were given extra enrichments compared to the other pen. And those were what the enrichment looked like. Every Monday, they were given wood logs, so 3 wood logs per pen. So they could carry them around, play with them, roll them, etc. They kept those wood logs until Wednesday, where they were removed, and instead they were given paper bags that they can shred apart, play with. They really liked the paper bags. And then they had new paper bags on Thursdays. And then on Friday, we removed the bags, and then we gave them those ropes. So they had 3 ropes per pen, and they can pull the ropes, destroy them. It was another form of enrichment. So they had the 3 different enrichments in this order every week for the whole experiment. We had these 5 treatments, and that is just to give you an idea of what it looked like. We had 2 rooms for our experiment, and this is just to illustrate that the treatments were randomized across the 2 rooms. So we didn't have an area with all the enrichment and an area with all the space treatment, for instance. They were mix and match across the different rooms. So we didn't risk biasing the results because one room is better than the other. for instance. So those were our treatments. And as I said, we had in total 830 pigs across those different treatments. And for the whole period of the experiment, so from 30 kilos up to 110 kilos, we collected a lot of data on all of those pigs. The first thing we did was a welfare assessment. And that happened at least once per round, or once per batch of the experiment. So in the first batch, we did it every week, but in the second batch, we did it only once, but at least once. So this welfare assessment consisted of two parts. First of all, it was a scan sampling. So scan sampling is what we call when we just, as an observer, we stand in front of the pen, and then we just count right now how many pigs are manipulating the walls or the floor. How many pigs are manipulating the pen fixtures? How many pigs are manipulating the enrichments? How many are manipulating other pigs or the ears or the tails? We also counted how many pigs are huddling. So if you don't know what huddling means, is when they lie very close to each other like this. So that's something we also looked at. We counted how many pigs were panting or shivering, and how many pigs showed stereotypies. So stereotypies is when they repeat for a period of time the same movement with their mouth, but it's a movement that has no obvious function. So it's not something that is logical. They just do this weird chewing again and again. And we have an example here. You can see the foam around the mouth. That's kind of typical of the stereotypies. Oh, sorry. I have to go back. I'm sure because it's actually a video. Yes. And you can see this movement with the mouth and then the licking of the wall, but this has no function to it. You don't get anything from it. That's a stereotype. So that's one of the behaviors we looked at. So those were for the scan sampling, when you just stand there and see right now how much pigs are doing this and this and this. The second part of the welfare assessment was a continuous sampling. So again, we stand in front of the pen, but now we look at the animals for 10 minutes continuously. And during those 10 minutes, we count how many times do we see playing. So that's an example of playing. A lot of turning around, running, going on the floor. It's quite obvious when we see it. We also looked at how many times we see aggression. So it's a little bit more, you can see it's a bit more intense than playing. It's really a bit more aggressive. And then how many times we saw mounting. So mounting is what we call when the pigs use both their legs and they mount on top of another pig. And we have another example here. And you can see the pig going on top of the other. So those were the three behaviors. We counted how many of those do we see when we observe the pigs for 10 minutes continuously. And after this welfare assessment, we were looking at the clinical scores. So we went into the pen and then we looked at each pig. And then we counted how many of those pigs are lean or fat. So how many have, as you can see, a very skinny body, or how many have a fat body where you have no waist visible and you have thick layers around the ribs, etc. We counted how many of the pigs are runts. So runts is what you call when a pig is smaller than the others. It has usually a long face. It has this weird hairs on the back. It's like a weird looking little pigs. They happen sometimes. So we also counted how many of those we have in the pen. We looked also at the body wounds. So we counted how many pigs have a mild amount of body wounds, which was what we call when they had less than 10 lesions. How many pigs had a moderate amount of body lesions, so between 11 and 20 lesions, and how many pigs had a severe amount of body lesions. And that's when we would say more than 21 lesions, so a lot of lesions in the body, and or when those lesions were bleeding and open, so it was severely injured. Then we also looked, we just listened and counted how many pigs we can hear coughing or sneezing. We also looked at their locomotion. So how many can we see are lame, obviously, or very severely, and how many have hernia. So if you don't know what hernia is this little pouch that develops on the belly. And we will look at moderate hernia, which is where you have this little pouch, but it's not preventing them from walking, and it's not bleeding. But we also had cases of severe hernia where it's much bigger, so it's actually preventing them from moving normally, and it may be bleeding sometimes. So we also counted how many of those pigs had those. We also looked at bursa. So it's maybe a bit hard to see, but that's let's see if I can find my screen. No, but that's what you can see on that picture in around the joints on the knee. You have like a little pocket that's not supposed to be there, and that's a bursa. And we have small bursas, so about the size of a grape, so it's very small, but you can see it around the articulations. We have large bursa, which are approximately the size of a walnut, and then extremely large one, which would be about a tangerine, so a bit that big. So those are pretty obvious. So we counted again how many of those pigs had these conditions. And then we looked finally at dirtiness. So how many pigs were moderately dirty? So they were approximately less of half of their body was covered with feces, but also severely dirty, as you can see on this picture here, where the pig is completely full of feces. So that would be an example of very severely dirty pigs. So we count how many of those we have. So there was a lot of little things to look during this clinical course, but that's really to get an idea of really everything that's happening inside Spain. Then we also weighted the pigs, so at least once or twice per round. And we used this, if you're not familiar with it, it's like a little machine like this, when the pig enters on one end, and then it's weighted, and then it exits on the other end. So we followed their rows and their growth curves. And then we also went every day in all the pen and looked for tail biting and ear biting. So tail biting is, and here you have an example of a very severe case, but that would be, as I mentioned earlier, when the pigs go and bite, manipulate and bite each other's tail. Sorry, and that leads to a bleeding tail. And in very severe cases, that can also lead to a bit of the tail falling off. So we would go every day, check each pig in each pen, and see is any of them having those injured tails, and we would measure those. And we looked also for the ears, if they had bites marked on the ears. So if they had, can you see, yeah, here on the outside of the ear, this is again a very severe example, but you can see some biting mark on the outside of the ears. So we would go every day in each pen, and we would have this one here that's an ear tag reader, so I could see and I could note if a pig had those issues, I can write down which pig it was. So we had it at individual level. And that's what it looked like. We are going into the pen and just checking how they're doing and their conditions. I was scratching their head so they could see their ears very well and the tails. And then we had the tablet that we could use to record all the data. So we did that every day for a lot amount of time. And then when we were doing it, so checking the ear and tails, we were also every day checking pen pooling. So that's what we call when the pigs are defecating in areas of the pen where they're not supposed to. So I can see, yes, here on the left, you have a clean pen. So here this area here is wet. That's normal. That's where they're supposed to defecate. That's also where the sprinkles, the showers are going on. So it's normal. But here you can see it's dry, and the pigs are lying and they are clean. There's no pieces on the floor. So that's a clean pen. But on the right here, you have a pen that has severe fouling. So you can see there's defecation all over the pen, not just in this area. It's all over. The pigs are very dirty. So that's a strong example of pen fouling. So we will also look at that every day once we go and see the pigs. And then for the pigs, for the treatments that had enrichment, so the enrichment treatments, when they were given those wood logs, the ropes, when we removed them, we'll also score how much they used them. Because you can see here, for example, this is the wood logs we removed for 1 day. You can see some of the pens really used the wood logs a lot. They removed all of the bark on this piece of log, for instance. But on this one, you can see did not really touch it. All the bark is here. They haven't really moved it. So we looked at how much they use those. And it's the same for the ropes. We looked at how much are they torn apart, if they have stretched them. So we were doing all kind of measures also there. We also had other kind of data collected more automatically. So we had videos above each pen, so normal 2D camera, so we can see all that's happening throughout the experiment. But we also had above some pen, some 3D cameras. And those are those from the dual sensors. And that means that so you can see an example of what it looks like here. You can see in 2D, so you can see the peaks normally. But the sensor and the camera can also evaluate the distance between the camera and the top of the peak. So it also has an idea of a 3D representation of the peak. And that is something that we can use, for instance, to determine the weight of the peak, so the weight at pen level, but also have more idea about if the pigs are feeding in the feeder, if they have their head in the feeder or not, things like that. So we can use those for certain behavior analysis that are quite interesting. And then we also had climate sensors. So in each pen, we had sensors that could record the amount of CO2 in the pen, the amount of ammonia in the pen, the temperature, the humidity, etc. So we had lots of information about what was happening in terms of environment in each pen. And then we also collected data at the end of the experiment at slaughter. So just before they were slaughtered, we collected saliva biomarkers and hair cortisols. And then when they were going to slaughterhouse, we went with them at a slaughterhouse, and then we collected all of their stomachs for each individual pig. And we had colleagues of us looking at stomach ulcers. So they were looking at the lining inside the stomach and seeing if they had like a damaged tissue inside the stomach that could correspond to an ulcer. So we had a score for each pig from 0 to 10. And then, of course, at the slaughterhouse, they collected lions, so the meat from the back of the pig, and those will be analyzed to look at the meat quality and the sensoric quality by our colleagues of the Danish Technological Institute, but that is what Marianne also mentioned earlier. So altogether, you can see we collected a lot of data from the welfare and the clinical scores to the weight and the growth of the pigs, the daily scores of tail biting and ear biting, the pen fooling, how much of the use, the enrichment, the video recording, the climate recording, the meat quality, etc. So we have a lot of data, and we definitely haven't analyzed everything yet. So I'm not going to give you a lot of crazy results on that. But that's just to give you the idea of how much work we have ahead of us now. So as I mentioned a bit earlier, we had 2 batches, so 2 repetitions of the experiment, one in the spring and one in the fall. And I just want to tell you a little bit about how those went, because when you have such repetition of the experiment, you expect they go the same. But in our case, they went very differently. We had completely different situation in both batches. So I just want to tell you a little bit about that. In the first batch, the pigs arrived. So when they were 30 kilos, we put them in our experimental facilities, and they did terribly. They started tail biting each other very fast. And if you're familiar with that, you know that once pigs start tail biting each other, it's like an epidemic. All of them started doing, because they get used to it. They like the taste. It's a bit blurry, but they like the taste of blood. So when they start doing it, they continue, and it kind of spreads. So it really becomes a problem. And really, that was the characteristics of this first batch. We had lots of tail biting. We had to remove pigs because they were too severely injured, and for experimental purposes, but also for ethical reasons, where the tails were getting too injured and they were in pain, we removed them and we put them away from the pigs that were hurting them. So we lost some things because of that. And to be able to deal with this problem, we actually started to give them straw. Originally, we did not wanted to give them straw because we wanted to have the treatments as they would normally be in conventional pig housing in Denmark, which is not straw, they're just there. But they were doing so bad, those pigs, that we started to give them straw to kind of calm them down. And then they stopped tail biting, and then they had a better growth towards the end. So they calmed down with the straw. But that was really the characteristics of the first batch, the tail biting. And then we had the second batch arriving. And we were afraid that this will happen again, those issues with tail biting. And therefore, we gave them straw from the beginning. And it did very good. There was no tail biting. The pigs seemed very happy, acclimatized in the environment. But very quickly, a few days after they had arrived, we started to hear them coughing. And we detected that actually they had came to our facility with pneumonia, which is not a fun disease to have in an experimental facility. And we had a big pneumonia outbreak. So we had to continuously treat them for a number of days. And we lost a lot of the pigs, even though we treated them as much as we could. Some of them did not make it. So it was a big problem in the second batch. So as you can see, we had completely different stories. But that's sometimes what happens. That's also why it's important to have repetition in your experiments. So if we look at the first batch, as I said, you can here see the number of scoring, the number of pigs scored with a bleeding tail or shortened tail, which is the characteristics of tail biting. And you can see on the left the first batch and on the right the second batch. So as I said, we had much more tail biting in the first batch than in the second batch, and that's what you can see here. If I can, yes. But what you can see also, and that's quite interesting, if you look at the first batch, is that the space treatment, so the treatments where the pigs had more space, they were only 9 or only 6 per pen, those had very little amount of tail biting. And of course, you would expect they have a bit less because there's just less pigs there. But still, there is quite a staggering difference. So it really seems that the fact that they had more space reduced the incidence of tail biting. And another thing that I see from this graph that I think is quite interesting is when we look at the enrichment treatment here. We didn't do any stats on that yet, but it seems that we have much more tail biting in the enrichment treatment than in the other treatments. And all of those have the same density. They all have 18 pigs per pen. So it was a bit surprising for us that the ones that were given enrichment, which is supposed to be a good thing for them, actually had more tail biting than the others. And that's also what we can see here. This is another way to see the data. That's the number of days where we scored. So let me give you an example so I can understand better. If I can find my... Yes, there it is. So here, for instance, it means that we had so we had one day when we scored 8 pigs having tail biting in the batch. And then a day we scored 7 pigs, etc., etc. So we can see, again, if we compare the space treatments and the other treatments, that we have much less days where we scored a lot of pigs with tail biting in the space treatments compared to the other treatments. But again, we can also see that there seems to be a bit of a difference with the enrichment treatment compared to the other two high-density treatments. So this was quite interesting result for us, and from that, it's a very preliminary result, but we seem to really see that there's a difference with the space treatments, and there is maybe something happening with the enrichment treatment. And that is something that was, as I said, quite unexpected for us, because generally we think that when we give environmental enrichment to the pigs, it's actually good for them. They get to chew, they get to play, they get to tear apart. So that's taking away some of their frustration, and that's actually reducing tail biting. And some of the studies have shown that. So what happens here? Why do we have pigs that are more tail biting if they are given enrichment? That was a bit weird. And my hypothesis, having been with the pigs at the farm for a large amount of days, I could see that when they had the paper bags it was not a problem because they had 3 paper bags, but they can tear them apart. So every pig could have a little bit of paper bags, they could chew them, everyone had a bit of it. But when it was ropes and wood logs, they only had 3 types of 3 ropes and 3 wood logs per pig. Per pen. And some of the pens, well, all of the pens were 18 pigs. So that's 3 units of enrichment for 18 pigs. So that's not enough for everyone. And actually, some of the pigs starting to be very defensive of the wood logs of the ropes. They would guard them. And we have an example here. You can see a pig with a wood log, and another is coming and trying to play with it. And we have a reaction from the other pig, starting to. It's not very aggressive, but it still wants to keep it. I'll show you again. So that may be a little bit of an example of a negative effect from this enrichment. And that could, we don't know, we haven't looked at the behavior or anything yet, but that could, in my view, increase aggression because the pigs that want to keep their wood log or their ropes, they get more aggressive. But I also increase frustration in the other pigs that don't have access to that resource. So I think that's an indication that we have to be a little bit careful with the type of enrichment we're giving. It's not just about we give enrichment and that's good and it's going to make better welfare. We have to think a bit about what type of enrichment we give. Is it an enrichment that can be shared, that everyone gets some, or is it something that can be monopolized by one pig or a couple pigs? How many of those enrichments do we give per pen? How often do we change them? How often do we give new enrichment, etc.? So we have to think about those things, not just giving enrichments. We have to think a little bit about it. Now, if we look at batch 2 and this issue of pneumonia, as I said, we lost some pigs, and that's what you can see here on that graph. So here you have the number of pigs that made it to slaughter. So if all of the pigs had survived, you would see in the control, roughage, and enrichment treatments, all of those will be at 18, which means that we'll have 18 pigs per pen in all pen. And then we'll have 9 pigs in all the space 1 treatment and 6 pigs in all the space 2 treatments. Now, what we can see here is that's not the case. We lost some pigs during that period, and 90% of the death of the pigs then were due to pneumonia. So this is a bit of an idea to see how impactful the pneumonia was across the different treatments. And what we can see here from that graph is that we lost pigs in all treatments except this space 2 treatment here. You can see all 6 pens of the treatment, all of them had the 6 pigs going to the slaughter. So none of the pigs died in this treatment. And if you look at the space ones, the treatment where they had 9 pigs per pen, they lost no more than 1 pig per pen to pneumonia. Versus if you look at other treatment here, we lost up to 4, sometimes 5 or 6 pigs in a single pen because of pneumonia. So again, that is, to me, an indication that we have a bit of a difference between the space treatments and the other treatments, where all the pigs got sick, all of them had to be treated, but the pneumonia led to less death. It was less severely impacting the pigs in the space treatment than in the other treatments. Now, if we look at the growth of the pigs, here you have the graphs for all 5 treatments, and we have here from between the moment they arrived and 4 weeks after they arrived. Here you have from 4 weeks to 7 weeks, and then from 7 weeks to slaughter. What we can see here, if we focus at this graph from arrival to 4 weeks, in that all of the treatments were roughly growing the same rate at about 0.9 kilos per day, except the enrichment. Here it is. The enrichment, they were growing a little bit slower than the others. And then in the middle part of the experiment, from 4 to 7 weeks, everyone seemed to catch up a little bit, except the space treatments, actually, that was slowing down a little bit. But then at the very end stage of the experiment, then it was the 2 space treatments here. They clearly had a better growth than the others. Everyone was about at 1.4 kilo per day, where the space treatments were around 1.5. And that's what you see here when we look at the general growth from arrival to the end to slaughter. So across the whole period, we have to see if this is significant, but we seem to have a better growth altogether in the space treatments than in the other. And here you have the same figure for batch 2. If I can, there we go. From batch 2, we only had one weighing then, so that's why you only have 3 graphs. But it's the same thing. From arrival to 4 weeks, it was actually the roughage that they were a bit slower at growing. But then from 4 weeks to slaughter, everyone was the same, except the space treatments that grow a bit better. And you can see it here in the whole period also. And that's again the same if we look at across both batches. So together, overall, we have slightly better growth from the space treatments, although we have to see that significant. And we also have this tendency for the roughage, the pigs, the treatments that were given roughage, they were growing a little bit slower at the beginning, but then they catch up towards the end. So they have a little bit of delayed growth. So again, we have to do all the statistics and we have to analyze that more in detail, but that seems to be a bit of the tendency we see in the growth data. Now we have here the clinical recordings, the clinical data that I explained to you. So you can see here we have the number of lean pigs, obese pigs, the runs, the small hairy ones, body wounds, coughing, sneezing, lameness, hernia, etc. This is all the different criteria that I introduced to you a bit earlier. And this is across all treatments. So it's just to have an idea overall what we saw. So we didn't have that many lean, so skinny pigs, but we had a fair amount of obese pigs by the end of the experiment, 37% of them. If I can make it, yes. We had no runs, so no of those small hairy pigs, we didn't see any of them. We had more than half of the pigs that were scored at some point with having consequent amount of body wounds on their body, or lesions in their body. We saw almost no coughing, sneezing, or lameness, which is, I think, a little bit surprising for the coughing and the sneezing. If you remember, one of the batch had pneumonia, so lung issue. So they definitely coughed and sneezed a lot, but this was only recorded a few percent. So that's already a little indication that maybe when we do this welfare assessment, we just go there once, we listen for 5 seconds. Maybe that's not giving us a full picture of what is happening, but we'll talk about that in a second. We had some pigs with hernia, a lot of pigs with the bursa, so the issue with the joints that has a little bulb on it. And then we also had a fair amount of pigs with quite dirty body, about 64%. So that's just a snapshot of what happened across all pigs. But then the next step for us will be to use all this data and to look firstly at the relation between this extensification factors, this treatment, and the mEATquality, which is the core purpose of this experiment in the first place. But we also want to look at the effects of these treatments on the risk of pain fouling, tail damage, ear damage, and the stomach ulcers. I think it's a very interesting thing to look at. And right now we're focusing on the reliability and validity of the animal-based measure of the welfare assessment. And I'm just going to explain to you a bit what we mean by that. When we do the welfare assessment, as I mentioned, we just go to the farm. And in general, in experiment, we went there at least once per round, some of the time every week. But in practice, in commercial farms, when people go and do welfare assessment, they go once at some point during the fattening period. And they go to that farm one day and they look at resource-based measure. So they ask the farmer, okay, how do you do your management of the animals? How much space the animals have? You measure what feed they're getting. You measure things that are always the same. It's like resource-based. But then you also look at the animals themselves, how they're doing. And that is the animals-based measure. And that's what I explained earlier. We do this continuous sampling when we look how many pigs are manipulating each other, how many pigs are manipulating the floor, things like this. And then we look at the different behaviors that they're performing. And this welfare assessment is developed to be really practical so that you can go one day on one farm and have a snapshot of what is happening. And it has to be fast. It has to be easy to do because different people can do it. And it has to be standardized. So it's very tricky to do, but we have a system that I think is working quite well. But still, we wanted to see, because we go only one day on the farm, how representative is this one snapshot we're taking? How much is it representative of the whole fattening period? In other terms, how reliable are those animal-based measures? So if we go and we look at the manipulation with the other pigs or the number of obese pigs or things like that, if we go one day, will it be the same thing if we go a week after or the week after or the week after? So that's reliability. How consistent is it over time? But we're also interested into the validity, and that means how can they show differences in welfare? So if we have our treatments here, do we have the same results across treatments? Because then maybe those measures are not the best to record welfare, because we know there are differences among our treatments in terms of welfare. But if we have the same results for the measures across the treatments, then maybe they don't really record what we think they're recording. So those are things we want to look at in the future. And again, just to give you an idea of what we mean, for instance, here, if you look at the ratio of obese pigs, and here you have the weeks on the x-axis. You see, if we go 2 weeks at the start of the experiment, we have no obese pigs. Week 4, no obese pigs. And then they start getting obese at week 6, 8, 10, and then they get more obese towards the end. Which means that if we do this welfare assessment at the very beginning of the period, we won't have the same results than we do it at the middle or if we do it at the end. That means that measure, the number of obese pigs, is not really reliable. It's not consistent over time. That's something we want to see. And then if we keep this measure, the number of obese pigs, we also want to see the validity. So as I said, how good is it to measure differences among welfare treatments? And here you have the same graph, but then you have here the control group, the enrichment group, refed group, space 9 pigs and space 6 pigs. You can see that there are small differences maybe in the space treatments, but overall, we don't see a clear difference between the treatments. So that means that this specific measure may not be the greatest measure to tell us about welfare because it doesn't differ between the treatments that we know have different welfare. So that is what we want to look at for all those animal-based measures. And this is just an idea of what it looks like. We have just on the graph like 2 days ago. But here you have the number of obese pigs, number of pigs with body wounds, number of pigs with bursa or dirtiness across the different weeks and across different treatments. And we have to look at it, of course, more in detail. But you can see that overall, we do have strong differences from one week to another, which means that we cannot just come 1 week and it doesn't say, this is not necessarily very representative of everything that's happening during the period. And we don't have very clear differences among treatments. So they may not be the best indicator to tell us about welfare. So that's other things we will look at. And it's the same here if we look at the continuous behavior, so the behaviors where we stand it for 10 minutes and looked at how many times do we see playing, aggression, mounting, etc. It seems to be a bit the same pattern when we have kind of a difference between different weeks and we don't have a clear difference between treatments. So the conclusions for now is that if you do experiment, it's important to replicate your experiment because you may have completely different settings happening in your applications. But if we look at our results altogether, so far, having done no stats or anything, it seems that the stronger treatments, the treatments that have the stronger difference to the others, seems to be the quantity of space with increased growth and also a difference in terms of the prevalence of tail biting and the severity of diseases like pneumonia and things like that. But we will have to check with the rest of the data. And we also have to be a little bit careful with the interpretation of the animal-based measure of the welfare assessment. But we're working now on a paper to go in detail into that. So you will see more about it soon, hopefully. And I want to finish this talk by addressing the students in the room. We at Aarhus University, we're always very happy to get interns and students especially from other countries, to come and work with us. And I really want to investigate this thing that I mentioned about the enrichment and how it impacts the pigs. So we had those three enrichments. We had the wood blocks, the paper bags, and the ropes. And we would really like students to come and help us work on, which enrichment do the pigs seem to prefer. Does it lead to positive welfare? Does it lead to negative effects or things like that? We have videos, we have all kind of data on that. So if you're looking for an internship or a place to do your thesis, and you are curious about coming to Denmark or studying animal welfare and behavior, please contact me or contact us. We're always happy to have new students. And that's it for me. If you have questions, as I mentioned, if it's too hard in English, you can try in Spanish, and I will do my best to understand it.